Welcome back. In this video, I will talk about the geometry editor, and that's a really powerful, often overlooked tool inside DAZ Studio that can help us with many issues, one of which is poke through. So poke through is kind of the main topic, and this is the reason why I'm bringing it up. But because it has so many other features, I might just mention a few along the way that can make your life in DAZ Studio a lot easier. So poke through is this thing that we'll encounter time and time again, and that is when clothing doesn't fit the character properly. So typically you have a shirt or something on the outside of a character and it doesn't quite fit them. So the character itself will poke through the shirt or poke through the clothing, and that'll appear as a kind of a skinny white patch that kind of pokes through, and that looks ugly, and there's a way to avoid that. One which we've seen is already the smoothing modifier, but it doesn't always work, and sometimes adjusting those settings isn't really getting rid of all the poke through. It might introduce poke through in other places that wasn't there before. So this is where other tools might come in handy, and the geometry editor is such a tool. Let me introduce you to my assistant here. This is George. Hello, George. How you doing? George is in good shape, and as such, not all 3D clothing might fit him equally well. It might have to be made a little bit bigger, and we can see that he has a couple of issues here. One is on his shirt up here, as well as on the underarm area here, and the other one is on his side here on the trousers. So that's the poke through I'm talking about. And one way to avoid that is to literally switch off the geometry underneath. So if I go and make George completely invisible now, by just clicking that little eyeball icon here, I can see that, well, George is completely gone, and so is the poke through, literally everywhere. But of course, George is gone in his entirety, so that's not exactly what we had bargained for. What the geometry editor is going to let us do is we will be able to select a portion of George, like namely just this portion, and just make that bit invisible. So not the whole figure, not something like a whole surface of the figure, but just one portion. And we'll be able to select that and store that inside DAZ Studio, or store it with our scene file so that we can bring it back later, or make it invisible again later. Let's take a look at this. So before we look at George, let me go and create a sphere primitive so I can show you some of the features that the geometry editor has. So new primitive sphere with the defaults. I'll select it, and then I'm going to move it over here so we can come back to George. I might go and make it a little darker just so that we can see this better as I demonstrate this. So with the sphere selected, I'll head over to the Surfaces tab, where we have one surface called Default. Every primitive that we create with DAZ Studio has that. A surface called Default. And then on the base color channel, I'm going to make this just a dark gray, something like that. There. Now we can see it a little bit better. I might also, because I'm not entirely sure if do I like the shine? I'm okay with the shine. I'll leave the shine. If you didn't like that, you can crank up the glossy roughness here if you wanted to get rid of that. So that's kind of nice that we can see all this in filament. I might set this to kind of 0.5 here. There we go. Now let me go and switch over to the geometry editor. So that's at the top here in the toolbar. I have it here. This is it, the one that looks like a little grid with a pencil icon type thing. That's the geometry editor. And it's another tool, so hence we also need to switch to the tool settings tab in a moment. Just in case this icon isn't here, head over to tools and select the geometry editor from here. Default shortcut key is Alt-Shift-G. So then with that guy selected, I'm going to switch over to my tool settings, where most of that evil magic is going to happen here. On here we have the groups, we have some selection modes, and we have a symmetry setting there. And as I said, we don't need to know all about these things, just the basic principle. These are groups, face groups, surfaces, regions, and selection sets. This is the one that we're going to be working with, but know that the principles of selection sets will also work for face groups and surfaces as well as regions. When we look at George, we're going to see that there's a lot of face groups in George, as well as surfaces, as well as regions. And surfaces is in fact the thing that we've been introduced to on the Surfaces tab. So if I open this up, I can see my default surface here. So that is the same surface. And in fact, the geometry editor is a tool with which we can create our own surfaces if we wanted to. It's also a tool that lets us rename this. So if I don't want to have this be called default, I can call it, I don't know, something like a test maybe. And then if I go over back to my Surfaces tab, I can see that my sphere now has a surface called test rather than default. So that's something interesting to keep in mind. If you wanted to make more surface sets, this is how you can do it with the geometry editor. Let me go and unselect this. So just click something in the gray bar. If you select this, then you see that my object turns red, and that means these polygons are now selected. If you select something in the gray area, then it unselects everything. So this is essentially the main job of the geometry editor. It lets us select polygons or vertices or edges. And that's in fact what this menu at the top is for. This is the polygon selection. So those are the little squares. These would be the edges. Those are kind of the, the edges. And then these are the vertices. Those are the little dots that we see. Currently, I don't actually see my geometry on the surface, so I might want to enable that so that I can select things a little bit better. I mean, I can select things here already, but I don't really know where my geometry ends and where it begins. So you might find it easier to switch from the filament viewport into either the wire shaded or the wire texture shaded modes. Filament itself, which is the one that I'm working with, also supports showing the geometry, and that is in fact under the Draw Settings tab. Just as an aside, if ever you wanted to work that way, and I might just actually work that way, over here under Drawing, so that's on the Draw Settings tab, under Drawing, you have Draw Node Wireframe. And if you enable that, then you can see that my wireframe is now overlaid on my geometry, both here as well as on George. So that's another way to enable and disable that. I might just stay in Filament for this and have a look at how we can select things here on our sphere. So I was just casually left-clicking and dragging over the sphere, and then it looks like I'm selecting polygons, and this is in fact exactly what happens. If I do that again, so if I go and left-click and drag somewhere else, then my previous selection goes away, so anything in yellow is selected, and my new selection is being created. If I wanted to select something and then add to this selection, you can hold down the Control key and then select something else that'll add to the selection. If you wanted to remove something from that selection, you can go and hold down the Alt key. That'll remove things from the selection. And this is now my active selection here. That's kind of neat. You also have symmetry options here, but typically when we deal with poke through, we don't really need that. Just know that it's there and explore it at your own leisure. Just in case, if you follow along and your cursor doesn't appear to do this, it might be that you're not in the drag selection mode. So we have several ways to create selections here, and they will appear when you right click anywhere in the viewport, and then you have this thing here, selection mode. So that is currently set to drag selection, and that's the mode that lets me left click and drag over my object to select an area. That's the one that I find more useful. But there's two others. One is the marquee selection, and that is in fact a rectangle that we can draw out like so. We can barely see it in the video, but if you left click and drag a rectangle out, then whatever is inside that rectangle will be selected as polygons. And the same goes for the other selection mode, which is the lasso selection, and that's not a rectangle, that's like a freehand thing you can draw out, much like we've used to it from other applications, and then anything inside will be selected. So this is most useful if you're not in the perspective view, if you're in an orthographic view. So if I'm going to go and look at my sphere from the front here, then I could go and use my marquee selection and left click and drag the whole top part of the sphere. And when I do that, everything here will be selected kind of evenly, like the top, the north half of the globe if you want. I'll go switch this back to my perspective view to have a look at it, and that's exactly how it happened. This is another thing to be aware of while we're selecting things with the geometry editor. Other 3D programs work slightly differently. So in Blender, for example, if I had done that, then only my visible, to me visible polygons will be selected, and anything behind it will be unselected unless I go into a separate mode. So DAZ Studio will select everything that is within this range, whether it is visible to the camera or not. So even polygons facing away from the camera will be selected. Just something to be aware of. So right click, selection mode, drag selection, that's what we want. While you have a selection active, like this yellow stuff here, you can go and save it as a selection set. In fact, as a selection set, or as a surface, or as a face group, or as a region if you want it. We're going to do this 2 times actually on the selection sets here. That's the one that we need, or that's the one I recommend you use for poke throughs. If you go and select this group here, this kind of heading, and then you right click on this with the selection active, you can say create selection set from selected. And when you do that, a little dialog comes up that asks you to give it a name. So I might call my selection Northern Hemisphere, like so. And then I have a selection that I can bring back. As I select this, it'll turn red, and that's just indicating this is where this group is. So if I go and select the bottom part here, you can see that the selection is still active, but the red thing has kind of gone away here. So the red thing is essentially this highlight color here. It's a little difficult to understand. The selection itself is still active. So if I wanted to get rid of that, if I wanted to clear my selection out, then we have to right click again, and then under geometry selection, you can select clear selection. If you work with this a lot, you might want to set up a shortcut key for this, but I'll leave that up to you. If I go and clear out that selection now, nothing's selected anymore. If I go and select this here, I can see the preview of where these polygons are. This is essentially a polygon group that I've created here. And if I wanted to select it now from here, I could go and click this little plus icon, and that will add this group to my active selection again. That's kind of the basics of the geometry editor, and that's really all we need to know. Now comes the fun part in which we can remove polygons. So with this selection active, either anything that I've selected from here or something that I've drawn in with my geometry brush here, I can now go ahead, right click on this and say geometry visibility, hide selected polygons. And this is kind of the magic formula here. Now I've made a hole in my sphere. It's not really a hole, it's just hiding the polygons. I can make a hole if I go and remove these polygons as well. I don't recommend that. Just know that there is this function in the geometry editor. It will change your geometry. It will change the UVs as a result. So careful with that feature. It is available. So doing it this way means it's non-destructive. I can now go and bring these polygons back because they're not removed. Currently, however, the problem is that my selection is gone. So that wasn't saved. The selection was there to hide the polygons now. Now that the polygons are hidden, my selection is gone. So to bring this back, I can right click again, polygon visibility, and I can say show all polygons, and that will bring them back. But my selection is gone as a result. So the cool thing is now, since I've saved myself a selection as a set, namely here on the Northern Hemisphere, let me go and click that plus icon to select my top of my sphere, and then go do the same thing again. Right click, geometry visibility, hide selected polygons, and boom, that is now the upper half of my sphere removed. Go and get rid of the highlight color here, and that now looks almost like a ball. I can't put anything in it because the polygons are still there. And the cool thing is I can just bring them back. With selection sets, we have the added option that we don't have to use the right click menu here. We can just use the little eyeball icon in that group here. So this is true for any of these groups here, face groups, surfaces, regions, as well as selection sets. So if I go and just click this little eyeball icon here, then my Northern Hemisphere comes right back or goes away again. And this is kind of handy when it comes to fixing poke through. Now the same principles that we had on the sphere will also apply to George. Let's turn our attention over to George and see how we can help the man. So let's go and select him first. Anything that you do will only work on the item that is currently selected in the scene tab. So I need to select George because he's the one whom we want to hide polygons on. And let's go and have a look at, might make my sphere invisible here. Let me have a look at this section here. So I can see polygons on here already. I can go and just left click and drag over George like so. If you find it's easier to see this, just feel free to switch over to something like wire texture shaded, or better yet, wire shaded, because that'll get rid of textures. And now we can see maybe a little bit better what we're selecting. If I go and do this from an angle, sorry George, looking at your butt there, then I can go and see that anything that's kind of white, I want to go and select something slightly further on the outside here. If you look at straight on it, you can barely see it, but if you see it from the side here, you can see that anything that's kind of white, that'll be the geometry on George that we've selected here. And if we go and go to our selection sets here, I'll go and right click and say create selection set from selected. I can call this one maybe hip poke for example, and that means I've made a new selection set that if I now go and click the little eyeball icon, it gets hidden. And that is nice. Now this is hidden on George, not on the item of clothing. The item of clothing is now above that hidden geometry, and therefore things look handsome. Let me go switch back to filament and see if that is in fact correct. And I'm also going to go over to my draw settings and switch off the draw node wireframe in filament so that we just see a preview here. And look at that. So the red thing is now just an indication that this is a highlight. Like on the tool settings tab, we have this highlight color. If I go and select nothing, then that'll go away. And so does my poke through. So this is that way that I recommend you fix poke through. If you ever have these issues, then create yourself a selection set for that region and just go and hide it with a little eyeball icon. Let's go and see what else we can do for George here. So there was the whole underarm area. There was also this on the back here. We might not be able to go and select this underarm area without posing him slightly differently. So I'll just go and use this little thing as an example. I go and left click and drag this on George. It doesn't matter if it's a little bit more. I go and head over to the selection sets, right click, create selection set from selected, and I'll call that back poke perhaps. And there we go. Select that little eyeball icon, and that is now also removed. Excellent. So we can go ahead and now select these parts of his upper body here. Sometimes it is helpful to use the existing face groups, surfaces, and or regions to select what we want. So just to give you an example of what I mean by that, if we were to open face groups here, you'll see that there's a lot of them here, and then it's important for them to be in place because these are used for the rigging under the hood to move portions of the figure if and when they need to be moved. So that's why we have so many selections. They're all tied to specific functions inside the figure as we work with him or her. So we can go and utilize them if we want. So for example, I can go and select the head. That is this whole area that's now red. Or if you go and click the plus icon, it'll be added to my active selection, or minus if you want to remove it, or just click the eyeball icon to hide things. So like, if you wanted to work on the eyes or teeth, then it's kind of easy to just hide the head from here, from within the geometry editor. That's possible. Once you've done that and you switch over to another tool, that selection and or visibility remains intact, just to be aware of that. I will go back and give George his head back, of course. What was I thinking? But you can also use these to start making your own selection. So if you find it difficult to figure out this underarm section here, you might find something that's kind of close to this area and then start with that and hide it from there. If you don't want to go into these groups, there's another way to start selecting these things, and that's by right-clicking. And then there is geometry selection. And then there is select by, and you have face groups, and you have surfaces, and you have regions, and you have selection sets. So these are available at your disposal from here as well if you haven't got the tool settings tab open, or if you want to work that way. Just thought I'd let you know that. And while we're talking about this, there's actually something else that I thought might be helpful, especially on this underarm section here, if we wanted to do that. So right now, I think I'm going to go and make George's arm invisible so that I can go and work on this area here. So this is the right arm. Let's see if I can find that. If this is too long a list, I can just go and use something else, maybe like the surfaces, because I'm sure that has an arms area. Let me go and make that invisible. There, George's arm's gone. Perfect. So now I can see that this is probably the section that we want to make invisible, but without encroaching on his actual arm. So I want the arm to be visible. So what I can do is select a few polygons here and then either just paint this whole area out. That'll work. Or if I wanted to grow something, I can also go and do that. If I go and start from one polygon, you can go and right click on this and then head over to geometry selection, grow selection. Control and the plus button will do that. As you do, you'll grow this selection out. So Control and plus will do that. Sometimes it grows it a little bit too rapidly. Control and minus will shrink that selection. So it's another way to select things, especially if you have a very high dense polygon model and you want to just grow out from a particular direction. That's also possible. It's the plus on the numpad, by the way, not the one on the top of the keyboard. It's a plus on the numpad. Let's see if I do this. That might be enough. That might be too much. Let's go and see if it works. With that selection active, I'll go and create another one here and say right underarm poke. Make that invisible. And then I'll go and bring his arms back. That was on a different group. Have we fixed the problem? Yes, look at that. Poke through taken care of. Click in the right area here to get rid of things like that. And there we go. George is looking handsome. He's looking a little bit crazy when you go and take his shirt off, because it means we will see George with holes in it. But for our final render, this is going to be just fine. There's a lot of other stuff that you can explore in the geometry editor, and I'll encourage you to do that because it is a very, very powerful tool that comes in handy time and time again. Like if we wanted to go back to our sphere, just to bring that to a close here, if I wanted to, like currently my sphere is just black, but if I wanted to go and select another shader like on top of this here, maybe I want to give him some eyes here, maybe like this, and then I'll hit Control, and I'll make that, and maybe hit Control and then do this. With kind of a smiley face on here. If I go and turn that, much like we had it before, if I go and left click on the selection set and then right click and say create selection set from selected, I can also do this in the surfaces tab, for example. So click it, right click it, hit create surface from selected, and I might call this one face. And if I do that, I've created a second surface group with the geometry editor, and that now has a different shader on it. So as a result, if I wanted to go and head over to my surfaces tab, I now have my test surface, which is like the rest of it. I could even call it body. Let's do that. Let's go over here, rename test into body just by double clicking it. Body, and then we have face. Head over to the surfaces tab. Body is now gray, or we can give it something like a friendlier color, like a dark blue maybe, and then I'll go and make his eyes. Switch that over to the universal manipulator. That'll also get rid of the highlights here. And then I go and make his face maybe something, you know, like a friendly yellow. So now I have two surfaces that I can adjust independently on the same object. So this might come in handy if you think, hey, I have trousers here and I wish there was a way that I can put my own texture on this part here. Maybe I want to make a pocket or whatever. Then you can do that. Just select this part and put a different shader on that part, and that'll give you another variety option to create your portrait renders. There we go. That is all I wanted to tell you about the geometry editor. There are other ways of fixing poke through. For example, instead of making the geometry underneath the clothing invisible, we could also just go take the clothing and lift it up slightly. Now the thing is, DAZ Studio doesn't have great tools for that built in, but many external editors have, such as Hexagon and Blender and ZBrush, as well as Marvelous Designer to a certain extent. And we're going to have a look at all of these in the next few episodes, because I think adjusting these items with external tools is a skill that'll come in handy time and time again. Join me for that.